I never imagined that my love for my only son would one day lead me into the depths of a nightmare. But as I sit here now, looking back, I see all the signs, the warnings I ignored, the moments I brushed aside, thinking, he's my son. He would never do something so cruel. I was wrong. And it all started the day I realized I wasn't just a mother, I was a fool who had trusted too much. My name is Margaret Dawson. I am 62 years old, and for most of my life, I believed that being a mother meant sacrificing everything for your child. When my husband, Henry, died in a tragic car accident, I was left alone to raise our 13-year-old son, Andrew. Losing Henry was the hardest thing I had ever experienced. But I had no time to grieve, I had a boy to raise, a future to build for him. So, I buried my sorrow and devoted every ounce of energy to ensuring that Andrew had everything he needed. For years, I worked 2 jobs, skipping meals just to save money for his education. I gave up vacations, hobbies, and even friendships, all to ensure that he had a good life. And when he graduated from college, I finally allowed myself to feel relief. I did it, I thought. I raised a good man. Or so I believed. At 35, Andrew married a woman named Lisa. She was polite but distant, always watching me with an unreadable expression, as though I were an inconvenience rather than family. I tried to be warm, to welcome her as a daughter, but I could feel the cold barrier between us. You can finally rest, Margaret, my friends would say. Andrew is grown, married, starting a family. Your job is done. But a mother's job is never done. I remember the day Andrew called me with the news that Lisa was pregnant. I had never heard him sound so excited. Maybe this is the moment that will bring us closer again, I thought. I had always dreamed of becoming a grandmother, of holding a tiny bundle in my arms and spoiling them with love in a way I never had time to do with Andrew. When Lisa reached her 3rd trimester, I visited them often, bringing fresh vegetables from my garden, hoping to help in any way I could. But there was always something off. One evening, I sat at their kitchen table, watching Lisa rub her swollen belly. So, I said, smiling, have you 2 picked a name yet? Lisa glanced at Andrew, her smile faltering. Andrew exhaled heavily. It's a girl, he muttered. I clapped my hands together, delighted. Oh, how wonderful. A little princess to love and spoil. But my joy was met with silence. Andrew didn't smile. He didn't nod. He just stared at the table as if I had spoken an unspeakable curse. Lisa forced a tight-lipped smile. We were really hoping for a boy, she said, her tone clipped. I hesitated, trying to brush off the unease creeping up my spine. Well, boys are great, too, but a daughter brings so much joy. You'll get to dress her in adorable outfits. And she'll always be Daddy's little girl. Andrew let out a sharp breath, shaking his head. It's not what we wanted. I felt my stomach tighten. The room suddenly felt colder. Not what they wanted. It was just gender disappointment. I told myself, some parents have a preference, they'd get over it once they saw their daughter's face for the first time. At least, that's what I thought. But as months passed and Emily was born, I started noticing the way they looked at her, not with love. Not with pride, but with something else, resentment. That was the first sign. And I ignored it. A mistake I would soon regret. It started with little things, subtle, almost unnoticeable details that gnawed at my gut but were too small to question. At first, I told myself I was imagining it. They're first-time parents, I reasoned. They just need time to adjust. But deep down, something felt wrong. From the moment Emily was born, I adored her. She was a beautiful baby, with big brown eyes like her father's and a soft little giggle that could melt the coldest of hearts. But her parents, my son and his wife, treated her as though she were nothing more than an obligation. When I visited, I expected to see them fawning over their newborn, doting on her every coo and cry. Instead, I often found Emily crying in her crib, red-faced, tiny fists clenched, desperate for comfort, and they just ignored her. Oh, my, what's wrong, sweetheart? I would say, rushing over to pick her up. But before I could, Lisa would stop me with a glare. Don't pick her up, mother-in-law, she'll get used to being held. I blinked, confused, but she's just a baby. Babies need to be held. Andrew sighed as if I were being dramatic. Mom, we're following modern parenting methods. Babies have to learn independence. If you keep picking her up, you'll spoil her. Spoil her? She was barely a few months old. I bit my tongue, reminding myself that parenting styles had changed since I raised Andrew. Maybe I was being old-fashioned. Maybe I was overreacting. I should have trusted my instincts. As Emily grew, my worries deepened. Every time I visited, her little body seemed thinner. Her once chubby cheeks hollowing out. Her clothes were too small, stretched at the seams, as if she had long outgrown them. She devoured food like she was starving. Whenever I brought snacks, fruit, crackers, anything, she would grab them with both hands, stuffing them into her mouth so quickly she could barely chew. One afternoon, I found her sitting alone in the living room, gnawing on a stale piece of bread. My heart clenched. "Sweetheart, are you hungry?" I asked gently. She nodded, her big eyes darting toward the kitchen. "Did Mommy and Daddy give you lunch?" She hesitated. Then, in a barely audible whisper, she shook her head. A cold dread settled in my stomach. I confronted Andrew that night. I had no intention of accusing him of anything, I just wanted to help. "Andrew, is everything okay? I've noticed Emily looks thinner. Is she eating well?" His face darkened instantly. "Mom, stop nagging. We're raising her the way we see fit." "I'm not nagging. I'm concerned. She's just a little girl. She needs proper meals. She needs attention. Mom, enough." His voice was sharp, cutting. I had never seen that look in his eyes before. Lisa appeared in the doorway, arms crossed. "Margaret, we know what's best for our child. Maybe you should stop interfering." Their words hit me like a slap. Interfering? Was it interfering to care about my own granddaughter? I swallowed my frustration, forcing myself to stay calm. "I just want to help," I murmured. Andrew exhaled, rubbing his temples. "Mom, you don't need to help. She's fine." She wasn't fine, but they refused to hear it. And from that moment on, my visits became less frequent. Not because I didn't want to see Emily, but because every time I did, I left feeling helpless, like I was watching a disaster unfold in slow motion. But deep down, I knew the truth, and I ignored it. For a brief moment, I thought things were getting better. Andrew and Lisa had announced they were expecting again. And this time, their excitement was undeniable. The cold distance they had once shown toward Emily seemed to melt away as they eagerly prepared for the arrival of their second child. Maybe, just maybe, they had finally embraced parenthood. Maybe they were beginning to love Emily the way I had always hoped they would. I wanted to believe that so badly. But then, Emily started getting sick. At first, it was just a cold, nothing out of the ordinary. Then came the fevers, the relentless coughing, the fatigue that left her too weak to play. Every time I called, Andrew had the same excuse. "Mom, she's not feeling well today. Maybe visit next week." "Mom, she's resting. It's best not to disturb her." "Mom, trust me, she's fine." But she wasn't fine. Weeks passed, then months, and every attempt I made to see her was met with another excuse. My once playful granddaughter, who used to run to the door and throw herself into my arms, was now a ghost of the child she used to be. The final straw came when I demanded to see her in person. "I don't care if she's sick. Andrew, I just want to see my granddaughter." After what felt like an eternity of arguing, Andrew relented. I drove straight to their house, my heart hammering against my ribs. The moment I stepped inside, I knew something was terribly wrong. Emily sat on the couch, wrapped in a blanket far too thin for the chilly weather. Her skin was pale, her cheeks hollow, and her once bright eyes were dull and lifeless. She barely looked up at me. "Oh, sweetheart," I whispered, kneeling in front of her. She was so small, too small. I reached out to touch her. But she flinched. She flinched. "Doesn't she need to be in a hospital?" I turned to Andrew, my voice shaking. He looked away, his face unreadable. "She's just tired." "Mom, no." "Andrew, this is more than tired. Look at her. She needs a doctor." He cut me off, his voice barely above a whisper. "We thought it was best for her to spend her final days at home." Final days? The words slammed into me like a physical blow. "What do you mean, final days? What's wrong with her?" Andrew didn't answer. Lisa appeared then, resting a protective hand over her growing belly. Her eyes were cold, indifferent. It's out of our hands. Margaret. Baba. She was trying to call me grandma. And she's not dying. Andrew, she needs medical help. You have to take her to a doctor. He ran a hand over his face. Exhaling deeply. It's too late, Mom. The doctors already said there's nothing they can do. I couldn't breathe. They were lying. I knew it, deep in my bones. But what terrified me more than anything was the look on their faces. There was no grief. No heartbreak. Just detachment. Like Emily was nothing more than an inconvenience. I wanted to scream, to shake them, to demand answers, but I knew if I pushed too hard, they would shut me out completely. So instead, I turned back to Emily, forcing a trembling smile. It's okay, sweetheart. Grandma's here. I'll come back soon, okay? She blinked up at me, her eyes glassy, but she didn't respond. And deep in my heart, I knew if I walked away now, I might never see her alive again. The call came early in the morning, jolting me awake before the sun had even risen. I reached for my phone with a sense of dread curling in my stomach. Mom? Emily's gone. Andrew's voice was flat, emotionless. I sat up so fast my head spun. No, that wasn't possible. What? My voice came out in a choked gasp. She passed away in her sleep last night. He continued, his tone eerily calm, as if he were telling me the weather forecast. It was peaceful. At least she didn't suffer. I clutched my chest, my breath ragged. Didn't suffer? I had just seen her. She was weak, yes, but she was alive. Something inside me screamed that this wasn't right. Did you take her to the hospital? What did the doctors say? I pressed, my heart racing. It's over, Mom. Andrew interrupted. We don't want to dwell on it. The funeral is tomorrow. It'll be a private affair. Just family. No need for anything elaborate. The line went dead before I could say another word. I sat there, gripping my phone so tightly my knuckles turned white. None of this made sense. A 4-year-old child doesn't just die overnight, without warning. And Andrew, my son, was speaking as if this were an inconvenience rather than a tragedy. Something wasn't right. A funeral that felt like a cover-up. The next day, I arrived at Andrew and Lisa's house, my stomach twisting into knots. The moment I stepped inside, the first thing I noticed was the silence. There were no mourners, no soft whispers of condolences, no framed photo of Emily on display, just a small, white coffin placed in the center of the room. That was it. My breath hitched. Where is everyone? I asked, turning to Andrew. No one else is coming. He replied matter-of-factly. Lisa's parents are overseas, and we don't see the need for a big funeral. We just want to say goodbye quietly. As a family. I stared at him, my blood running cold. This wasn't grief. This was dismissal. I'd like to see her, I said softly, stepping toward the coffin. Andrew moved in front of me so fast I nearly tripped. No, he said sharply. You don't want to see her like this. Her body, it's not in good shape. It's better to remember her as she was. My gut twisted with something I couldn't explain, fear, suspicion, a deep, unshakable sense of wrongness. Not in good shape? Emily had been sick. Yes, but not that sick. Why wouldn't they let me see her? I glanced at Lisa, hoping for some confirmation, some trace of sorrow, but she only stood there, hands resting over her swollen belly, her expression disturbingly blank. They weren't mourning. They weren't grieving. They just wanted this to be over. I stood by the coffin, staring at the polished wooden lid. My fingers hovered over the edges, aching to lift it, to see my granddaughter, to say my final goodbye. Andrew's phone rang. He stepped outside to take the call. Lisa followed him, and then, I heard it, a faint, muffled sound, a sound that could not, exist. Grandma, help me? I stopped breathing. The whisper was weak, barely there, but I heard it, and it was coming from inside the coffin. For a split second, my mind refused to process it. It wasn't possible. Emily was dead. Then it came again. Please, help me? My entire body erupted in chills. With trembling hands, I gripped the edges of the lid and wrenched it open. And what I saw inside made my world collapse. Emily, alive. Her little body was bound with ropes. Her mouth covered with a cloth. Her wide, terrified eyes staring up at me. Grandma, she whimpered. tears streaming down her face. They had buried her alive. I had trusted Andrew. I had believed him. And I had almost let them murder my granddaughter. But now, I would make them pay. Time stopped. For a moment, I couldn't move, couldn't breathe, couldn't even comprehend what I was seeing. Emily, my granddaughter, whom I had been told was dead, was alive. Bound with ropes. Her tiny body crammed into the coffin like she was nothing more than a discarded doll. Her face was streaked with tears. Her lips trembling around the rag stuffed into her mouth. "Grandma," she whimpered, her voice hoarse and weak. A violent shudder ripped through me. My knees nearly buckled. This was not real. It couldn't be real. But the horror in Emily's eyes told me otherwise. And then, rage took over. With trembling hands, I pulled the gag from her mouth. "It's okay, sweetheart. Grandma's here. You're safe now," I whispered, my voice shaking as I fought to keep myself together. I worked quickly, my fingers struggling to untie the cruel knots that had kept her imprisoned in this dark, suffocating box. How long had she been in there? 2. And the most terrifying question of all, what would have happened if I hadn't heard her? The moment the last rope fell away, Emily collapsed into my arms. Her little body was so fragile, so cold. I held her close, feeling the weak, shallow rise and fall of her chest against mine. She was alive, but just barely. But first, I needed answers. A rustling outside jolted me back to reality. Andrew. I had seconds before he returned. Heart pounding, I quickly lifted Emily and carried her across the room, scanning for a hiding place. My eyes landed on the closet. I threw open the doors, pushing aside coats and shoes, and knelt down. "Sweetheart, I need you to stay here. Okay?" Emily's eyes widened in fear. "No, Grandma, please." I cupped her face, forcing her to look at me. "Shush, baby, just for a little bit. I promise I won't let them hurt you again." Tears welled up in her eyes. But she nodded. I kissed her forehead, then carefully shut the closet doors just as the front door opened. Andrew walked in, adjusting his coat. He didn't even glance at the coffin. Didn't even care. "Mom, you should go home. Lisa's in labor. We need to get to the hospital." My blood turned to ice. They had been so focused on the birth of their son. They were willing to bury their daughter alive just to get rid of her. "What about Emily's funeral?" I asked, testing him. "Anne, that doesn't matter now. My son is coming. My son. Not my child. Not our baby. Only my son." I clenched my fists so tightly that my nails dug into my palms. He truly didn't care. Emily was nothing to him. I forced a smile, masking the fury burning inside me. "Go. Be with Lisa. I'll stay here to watch over Emily's body." Andrew hesitated. For a second, I thought he saw through me. "Just don't open the coffin," he said finally. "I don't want you remembering her like that." I nearly laughed. "Too late. Of course, sweetheart," I murmured. And then, just like that, he left. He had no idea. No idea that Emily was alive. No idea that he had just given me all the time I needed. I turned back to the closet, yanking the doors open. Emily stared up at me with wide, fearful eyes. "We're leaving," I told her, my voice firm. She reached for my hand. I scooped her up, pressing a kiss to her forehead. "Grandma's got you, baby, and I swear to you." My voice dropped to a whisper as I looked toward the door where my son had just walked out. "They will never hurt you again." And with that, we disappeared into the night. 3 hours after escaping with Emily, my phone rang. "Mom, Lisa had the baby. It's a boy. You have to come see him." Andrew's voice was brimming with excitement, so much excitement for his new son. And yet not a single word about his dead daughter. I stood in my kitchen, clutching my phone, staring at Emily as she curled up on the couch, wrapped in one of my softest blankets. She had eaten more in the last few hours than she probably had in weeks. Her tiny hands clung to a stuffed rabbit I had given her. But her eyes, her wide, frightened eyes, never left me, as if she was terrified that if she blinked, she'd wake up back inside that coffin. I reached down, smoothing her hair. "Congratulations," I said into the phone, forcing my voice to remain steady. "I'll come to the hospital soon." But this wasn't a congratulatory visit. This was war. Look, Mom, isn't he perfect? I stepped forward, peering down at the child, innocent, unaware of the monsters who had given him life. He's beautiful, I murmured, and then I turned to look at the two of them, the man I had raised and the woman he had chosen. And what about Emily? I asked, my voice razor sharp. The air in the room shifted. Lisa, what about her? I folded my arms, tilting my head. Shouldn't we talk about her funeral? You know, the one you planned so hastily? Lisa let out a nervous laugh, glancing at Andrew. Oh, we actually decided to skip all that. We're just going to have her cremated. We've been so busy with the baby. You understand. Busy? Busy with a new baby while their firstborn was supposed to be lying cold in a coffin? I clenched my jaw. So you won't be needing the money then? Andrew blinked. What money? I reached into my purse, pulling out a piece of paper. It was a government form. An application for funeral assistance. Filed by Andrew and Lisa. For Emily. Lisa's face turned pale. Andrew's fists clenched. Where did you get that? He hissed. I smiled coldly. I found it in your house. Right next to this. I pulled out a small, leather-bound notebook and tossed it onto the hospital bed. Andrew's face drained of color. Shall I read it aloud? I asked, my voice filled with venom. Lisa lunged for the notebook. But I snatched it back. Don't bother, Lisa. I've already read every word. The funeral is just for show. Once it's over, we'll collect the aid money and move on. Andrew shot out of his chair, eyes blazing. You went through our stuff? You buried my granddaughter alive. Silence. Lisa's breath hitched. Andrew's hands trembled. That's a lie, Lisa blurted. I let out a bitter laugh. Is it? Because Emily told me exactly what happened. She told me how her daddy and mommy tied her up and put her in a box. How they said she had to be a good girl and wait for the angels. Lisa turned to Andrew in panic. This is bad. Andrew, what do we do? What do we? Shut up, Andrew roared. But it was too late. I reached into my purse again, this time pulling out Emily's hospital report. Did you really think I wouldn't take her to a doctor? I whispered, my voice filled with disgust. I tossed the papers onto Lisa's lap. Malnutrition, multiple bruises, severe dehydration, weeks of abuse. I looked them dead in the eye. Emily was dying because of you. And then, instead of saving her, you tried to get rid of her. Lisa burst into tears. Please, Margaret, we were under so much stress. We weren't thinking straight. Andrew remained frozen, his face blank. And then, he smirked. He actually smirked. So what? He said, shrugging. My blood turned. So what? We didn't kill her, he said nonchalantly. We just stopped taking care of her. If she died, she died. It wasn't really our fault. Was it? I saw red. For the first time in my life. I wanted to hurt my own son. My hand shot out before I could stop myself, gripping the front of his shirt, yanking him down to my level. You are no son of mine. I spat. His smirk faltered. And you, I turned to Lisa, who was sobbing into her hands, are a disgrace to the word, mother. Then I let them go and stepped back. It's over, I said, voice calm now. The police are on their way. And Child Protective Services, too. You'll never see Emily or your son again. Lisa's sobs turned into a shriek. Andrew lunged toward me, but the door burst open before he could reach me. The police were here. 2 officers stormed in, and within seconds, Andrew was forced to the ground, his hands wrenched behind his back. Lisa screamed as she was pulled from the hospital bed, handcuffs clicking into place. You can't do this, Andrew shouted. Mom, you can't take my kids away from me. I looked down at him, disgusted. They were never yours to begin with. And with that, I turned and walked away. Because waiting for me, just outside that door, was Emily, safe, warm, and finally free.